Hey folks, I'm Dan Keldsen, co-founder of plexicam.com, and we are doing Insights for Pros, a series of short videos from experts around the world with the goal of helping you level up your career. My guest expert is Tisha Parker Kemp. She's the founder and principal of shiftEDacademy.ca. Welcome, Tisha.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here.
So this topic, we're covering several different topics with most of our experts. This one happens to be about rocking the virtual podium. And I don't know if that because I actually studied rock music and I am not really much of a musician anymore, but I love music. That really resonates for me. Is it actually a reference to music or just the concept of rocking the podium?
That's a great question. That phrasing actually came from a course that I had facilitated a couple of years ago before the pandemic hit. And I was doing a lot of workshops for the provincial government, business organizations, and one of the participants suggested this course should be called Rock the Podium. And so it's been this phrase that is kind of taken on a life of its own, but it's thanks to one of the previous participants at a workshop.
Oh, well, there you go. That's the benefit of collaboration, even accidentally.
Absolutely.
So rocking the virtual podium. So I love the idea. I don't like the idea of podiums because that's usually a trap if you're if you're presenting physically. Ironically, I'm currently trapped because of the nature of my studio here, and I can't stand up. But what are so to me, rocking the podium means you're bringing energy to this. You're sort of in control. What are the barriers to making that happen?
There's a few different barriers that, and this depends on the different stage of comfort level that people have with an audience.
Sure.
But
Yep.
typically, what I witness with people is there is this feeling of, I need to be perfect. I need to have the answers to everything. And because that's virtually impossible, we put so much unrealistic pressure on ourselves that we then become our own worst enemies. We put the barriers up in front of us. So
Mm.
when we think about the whole psychology that people run into, it's there's a whole number of things. If anybody is interested in the research on that, they could certainly reach out. But there's sociological impacts, there's cultural impacts, there's I mean, we are very complex humans, and
Right.
there are so many things that inform the position that we have. There, I mean, we have two eyes that if we have vision, that we are able to see the world through, and all of
Hmm.
our previous experiences, and we then create this expectation in our own minds that we have to show up in a certain manner, and that our audience expects this level of perfection, and that in and of itself just gets in people's way. So all sorts of things start to happen with our cognitive resources that before we go out on a stage, for example, or before we turn the webcam on, that we have this panic, right? This fight or flight sensation. And a lot of people do feel that. And this psychological ends up being physiological. So we lose the
Right.
saliva. We start to forget what we were going to say. All of the oxygen is actually, we don't know this, we don't feel it, but the oxygen is actually leaving our brains and going to our core. This is part of the fight or flight response that physiologically we have. And where
Right.
all of the oxygen is going to protect our organs, we don't have enough going to our brains, so we're not thinking clearly. So there's all sorts of not only psychological barriers, but it manifests into these physiological barriers as well.
Right. Yeah, that's we should have meters on our arms or something that show that oxygen levels to the brain are are running low. Maybe that's my next business. I don't know.
There you go.
So so I mean there's natural, so billions of years of evolution have caused our brains and bodies to interact in ways that used to be very handy if you needed to outrun a saber-toothed tiger or avoid them. Not so much if you need to stay on point in front of, I don't know, shareholders or something like that. So what are some techniques that you'd recommend to get back to a level of comfort or improve your level of comfort anyhow. And maybe let's take a worst case scenario. So you know that you should get better at presenting and rocking a podium of some kind, but just going over that first hurdle to, okay, how do I do this at all? It's not natural. My business partner, Tom, phenomenal speaker. He's the best speaker I've ever seen. And I've known him since 1994. He was born to speak. And he has also worked at it. So he's very, very good. Most people, though, they don't really, their clues about how to do this is really probably a mess in their head. So is there some way that we could help them sort that out so they can take that first step, and then we'll work through a little progression here?
Yeah, I mean, your colleague is in a small percentage of the population that
Right.
they have this more natural inclination and less fear going into it. I mean, depending on which research study you've tapped into, there's a consistent 76% of the population of the planet that has this condition called glossophobia, which is a fear of public speaking. And so this is the norm, right? People generally are not born with the skill of presenting effectively to their audience for the purpose of reaching an objective. So when we think about that bulk of the population that goes through that experience, then I wrote a couple of ebooks. One of them is Power Up Your Presentations, and there's an exercise that I put into that, and it's completely adaptable to whatever your comfort level is or whatever your space affords. But the Power Propeller essentially is a breathing and a physical exercise that you can do that will increase the blood flow, get that oxygen pumping. So if you know just before you're about to either walk on stage or walk in that boardroom, you can find a quiet space, a restroom somewhere where you can get an opportunity to basically flail your arms around, go for a power walk, do that purposeful breathing so that you're setting your body up physically to have oxygen forced back into your extremities, including your brain. So physically, there are things that we can do, but there are also other psychological elements. I mean, the fact of the matter is a lot of people feel this lack of confidence when they're about to have an audience. And the experience that we have internally often manifests into external, how we carry our bodies. So we end up with more closed body language. We end up with our shoulders kind of tightened. The nervousness pulls that body language a lot tighter. So being purposeful and mindful of keeping that open body language, it may feign your level of confidence as being higher than what it actually is. But the purpose behind that is, and Amy Cuddy talks about this. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She did one of the most popular TED Talks on the internet. She wrote a book called Presence, and she talks about the fake it till you make it. And it's misunderstood that people think, okay, well, just pretend you know what you're doing when you don't. And that's not the case. What you're actually doing is you are pretending or telling yourself, convincing yourself that you are confident and doing the things that confident people do with their body that trick your audience into thinking that you're more confident than you are. And eventually that becomes more comfortable and you believe it yourself. So you want your audience to believe it, even if you don't, and eventually you will believe it yourself.
Right. Yeah. Usually people paint a far worse case scenario in their own minds that probably 99% of your audience is not actually concerned about on your behalf or for themselves necessarily. So the mind is a dangerous thing, as it turns out.
Yes, and that inner dialogue is probably the biggest liar that we'll ever meet.
Yeah. And you can't shut it off. That monkey mind's chattering away quite badly.
That's right. We just have to take that and park it over to the side. And when the presentation or that meeting is done, we'll come back to it.
Yeah. So I'd looked through a lot of your ebooks, really love the format and how it encapsulates. To me, it felt like the right amount of information, so it wasn't overwhelming and it wasn't too little, and it felt very actionable, which is always awesome, instead of forcing people to figure it out themselves, which why bother to write or present or anything if you're not helping people.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And I think in general, based on what I've seen of your work and your website, that's very rare too in my experience. I love writing. I like doing research. Most people are not very good at that and partly that's because the educational system doesn't prepare you for writing persuasively, among other things, or speaking persuasively. But fewer words that are the right words is always a wonderful goal, carries into writing and presenting. I did want to talk about one thing that really is central to what Plexicamp does: eye contact. Much easier. You do training with people on how they engage through a lens instead of in person, where they might be able to walk into a crowd or talk to somebody directly right there, put in front of them?
So I'll talk about the online first. Of course, Plexicam is one of the first things that I recommend to have that investment so that they don't have to worry. They know they're looking directly into the webcam and they can position it anywhere they want on their monitor. But if they haven't invested or they're waiting for it to come in the mail, then what they can also do is, and this is something typical of most platforms, Zoom, GoToMeeting, I've used probably 15 or 20 of those platforms over the years. They take up your entire real estate of your monitor. And what I usually do, squish that window up, resize it so that it's as close to your webcam as possible. And at least then you're able to feign that level of eye contact. But Plexicam is just a hands down better option. Now, when it comes to being in a room physically with people, you alluded to smaller the room, the easier it is to make eye contact. Whereas if you're walking onto a stage with, 1,500 people and you've got spotlights that prevent you from actually seeing anybody or seeing them well. TED, that's their format. The room is dark, the audience is in the darkness and the spotlight and the lighting is all on stage. You can't necessarily see your audience. So imagine your favorite people sitting there cheering you on, and this just psychologically allows you to let go of that anxiety. But if you're physically walking into a smaller room where 15, 20, 50 people are there waiting to hear what you have to say, finding the smiling, welcoming faces and moving from one to the other, knowing who those people are in the early moments, and just keep cycling back through them. The disconcerting thing that sometimes happens with people is, and this is an acronym you may or may not be familiar with, RBF, where this is a resting face that sometimes people have. We sometimes look at people in our audience and think, oh no, they don't want to be here. Somebody forced them to come. They're not interested. And it's simply the way that they hold their face. They might be your biggest fan. They might be the most in-tune person and waiting with bated breath to hear what you have to say. So I don't necessarily feed into this whole notion of only looking for the smiling faces, but knowing that even if they're not smiling, it doesn't mean that they're not about to enjoy what it is that you have to say.
Right. And and emotions aren't always reflected on the face or the body accurately. So it's again that sort of mind tricks that they must hate me. Clearly they hate me. Why do they hate me so much? And then you get derailed. One of our earliest adopters, interesting enough, was Mark Bowden, who's in Toronto, not in your part of
Yes,
Canada.
I know Mark.
But he's okay. Yeah. So for those who don't, incredible body language expert. The stuff that he does, he's so good. It's every time I watch him, and I watch him a lot, I just learn something new. It's really wild. But body language does mean things. Faking it till you make it is definitely very useful. As far as if you're not feeling the energy naturally, you can do things that will give it back to you. But it's funny how much that the comfort and the delivery of whatever you're presenting is a lot more dependent on your body and mind, really, than it is on your content necessarily. Although bad content isn't going to do anybody any good. But there are other things that are much more in your control, which is what I am trying to impart to people, that if you're afraid, it's totally natural, as you said, and there are ways to lessen that fear. And part of it is repetition, but also using tips like you already explained.
100%.
Cool. So I love it. And for folks who have been watching this or listening to this, definitely check out the ebooks that we were talking about, and they're nice little nuggets, very good, short and sweet. I love checklists. It reminded me going through your material that I should reread the Checklist Manifesto for people who haven't read that. Awesome book. And I love what we've been talking about. Hopefully we'll have you back again for another session. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Dan. And your listeners, keep following Dan. He's got some great ideas. Plexicam is just one of them.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan.